What if love isn't about promises, but about choosing to stay when someone feels most vulnerable? Hello everyone, wishing you a wonderful day. Today we're exploring a quiet journey where James and Diep discover that real love doesn't speak loudly. It stays, listens, and walks beside you in silence. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next episodes. The morning arrives quietly, without announcement, no alarm, no rush. Just a thin layer of mist hanging over the mountains, softening every sharp edge of the landscape. The small homestay is still half asleep, wrapped in the cool breath of dawn. James wakes first. He doesn't move right away. He just lies there, listening. The distant sound of a rooster somewhere down the slope, the faint creak of wood as the house settles. Beside him, Diep is still asleep, turned slightly toward the window, her breathing slow and even. There's something fragile about the moment, like if he moves too quickly it might break. James sits up carefully and pulls on a sweater. He steps outside, letting the cold air hit his face. It wakes him fully. The mountains are barely visible, outlines blurred by fog like unfinished sketches. He exhales slowly, hands tucked into his sleeves. A few minutes later, he hears footsteps behind him. Diep appears at the doorway, hair still loose, eyes not quite awake. She wraps her arms around herself, shivering slightly as the cold reaches her skin. James notices immediately. Without saying anything, he takes a step toward her and drapes his jacket over her shoulders. The movement is automatic, almost instinctive. Diep pauses, surprised, then lets it happen. She doesn't thank him. She just pulls the jacket closer and stands beside him. They don't talk. They watch the fog move instead, thinning little by little as the light grows stronger. The silence between them isn't empty. It's full of shared space, shared breath, shared calm. After a while, Diep speaks, her voice low. Morning feels different here. James nods. Slower. She hums in agreement. They sit on the wooden steps with 2 cups of hot tea the host left for them earlier. The warmth seeps into Diep's hands. She closes her eyes for a second, letting it travel through her fingers, her wrists, her chest. This is nice, she says quietly, not having to go anywhere yet. James looks at her, really looks at her. The way her shoulders aren't tense this morning, the way her jaw isn't clenched like it usually is when she's thinking too much. We don't have to, he says, not today. Diep opens her eyes and turns to him. You don't mind, he shakes his head. The trip isn't the point. That sentence lands heavier than he expects. Diep looks away, back toward the mountains. For a moment, James wonders if he said the wrong thing, but then she nods, just once. I forget that sometimes, she admits. I always feel like, if I stop, I'm falling behind. Behind what? James asks gently. She exhales. Everything. They sit with that word hanging between them. After breakfast, they walk slowly through the village. There's no map, no plan, just narrow paths, small houses, gardens bordered by stones. People pass them with easy smiles, nods of acknowledgement that don't demand conversation. Diep walks a little behind James at first, hands tucked into his jacket sleeves. The path is uneven, and she watches her steps carefully. At one point she stumbles slightly. James turns back immediately, reaching out. His hand catches her arm, steadying her before she can fall. I'm okay, she says quickly out of habit. But she doesn't pull away. Her fingers curl around his wrist instead, light but intentional. She keeps hold as they continue walking. James slows his pace without mentioning it. They reach a small clearing where the village opens up into a view of the valley below. Diep stops there, staring out. The wind lifts strands of her hair, brushing them across her face. I used to think places like this were lonely, she says. James waits. When you're far from everything, she continues, it feels like if something happens, no one will hear you. He considers her words carefully before responding. Do you still feel that way? She hesitates. A little, then softer. Less than before. James doesn't say anything. He just steps closer, close enough that their arms touch. Not holding, just there. They wander into a small local market later that morning. It's modest. Just a few stalls with vegetables, fruit, handmade goods. Diep's eyes light up in a way James hasn't seen in a while. She moves from stall to stall, asking questions, smiling, genuinely curious. At one stall, she picks up a woven bracelet, running her fingers over the threads. Too simple? She asks. It looks like you, James replies without thinking. She looks at him, caught off guard. What does that mean? He shrugs, a little embarrassed. Quiet, strong, doesn't try too hard. She laughs softly. That's not how I see myself. I know, he says, but it's how you are. She buys the bracelet anyway. They sit down on a low stone wall near the edge of the market, sharing a simple meal wrapped in paper. Diep eats slowly, like she's not in a hurry to finish. She leans back slightly, letting the sun warm her face. James watches her from the corner of his eye. You keep looking at me, she says, amused. Do I? Yes. He doesn't deny it this time. You look lighter today. She thinks about that. Maybe because I don't feel like I have to be anything. He nods. You don't. The afternoon stretches on, unhurried. They walk back toward the homestay as the light begins to soften. Shadows grow longer. The air cools again. Halfway back, Diep suddenly stops. James turns. What's wrong? She pats her pockets, checks her bag. Her movements are calm, but her eyes flicker with something else. My phone, she says. I don't feel it. James waits, watching her carefully. Did you have it at the market? I think so. She pauses, then adds, I'm not sure. She doesn't panic, she doesn't raise her voice, but her shoulders stiffened just slightly. Her fingers curl inward. James steps closer. We can go back and look. She nods, but she doesn't move right away. After a moment, she speaks, her voice lower than before. I don't like this feeling, she admits. Being unreachable. James hears the weight beneath her words. He reaches for her hand, this time deliberately. You're not alone, he says. I'm right here. She looks at him, searching his face, then squeezes his hand once. Okay, she says. Let's go together. They turn back toward the fading light, steps slow but steady, hands still linked as the day begins to close around them. The path back toward the market feels different now. Not dangerous, not rushed, just quieter in a way that presses closer to the skin. The light is fading faster than either of them expected, the sun sinking behind the mountains and pulling the warmth with it. The air turns cool again, sharp enough to make Diep draw James's jacket tighter around herself. James notices her grip on his hand hasn't loosened. He doesn't comment on it. He just adjusts his pace so it matches hers exactly. I'm sorry, Diep says suddenly. James turns his head slightly. For what? For stopping us. For making us turn back. She keeps her eyes forward. You said the trip isn't the point, but I still feel like I'm ruining the flow. James slows to a stop. That makes her stop too. He turns to face her fully. The path is empty. Just the two of them. The sound of wind brushing through trees. The distant murmur of the village below. Look at me, he says, not firmly but clearly. She does. I didn't say the trip isn't the point to be nice, he continues. I meant it. She searches his face like she's checking for cracks, for hesitation. And this, he adds, lifting their joined hands slightly, this is not an interruption. Her throat tightens. She looks down, blinking once. I'm not used to someone adjusting their plans because of me, she admits. I usually just adjust myself. James nods slowly. I know. That answer surprises her. You do? Yes. His voice stays calm. I see it. She lets out a small, shaky breath. Then why are you okay with this? He thinks for a moment, choosing his words carefully. Because I don't feel like I'm giving something up, he says. I feel like I'm choosing something. They stand there for a few seconds longer. The silence wraps around them again, but this time it's heavier, more honest. Then Diep squeezes his hand. Okay, she says, let's keep going. When they reach the market, most of the stalls are already closing. Vendors pack away baskets, fold cloths, count the last of their change. The earlier liveliness is softened into something slower, more intimate. Diep scans the area, her eyes moving methodically. She doesn't rush, she doesn't spiral. But James can feel the tension under her calm, like a wire pulled too tight. They retrace their steps from earlier. The bracelet stall is gone. The stone wall where they sat is empty now. Diep pauses there, touching the surface absently like she's grounding herself. James watches her, ready to speak if she needs him to, ready to stay quiet if she doesn't. After a few minutes, she exhales. I think I left it near the vegetable stall, she says. I remember putting it down. They walk further in. A woman nearby looks up as they approach. Are you looking for something? The woman asks kindly. Diep hesitates for half a second, then nods. My phone. I think I left it here earlier. The woman smiles and reaches under her table, pulling out a familiar shape. This? She asks. Diep's breath catches. Yes, she says, relief flooding her voice. Yes, that's it. She takes the phone, fingers trembling just slightly. She checks the screen. Dead battery. But it's there. Safe. She bows her head in thanks, words tumbling out too quickly, gratitude spilling over. As they walk away, Diep slows again. James glances at her. You okay? She nods. Her eyes are glossy. I didn't realise how much that scared me until just now. He doesn't joke, doesn't brush it off. He just listens. When I couldn't find it, she continues, it felt like everything could disappear. Like I could disappear. James stops walking and gently pulls her closer, not into a full embrace, but close enough that their shoulders touch, solid and steady. You didn't, he says simply. She swallows. I know, but my body didn't. He nods. That makes sense. They stand like that for a moment longer, then turn back toward the homestay. The sky's deepening into blue, the first stars beginning to show. On the way back, Diep walks closer than before. Their arms brush with every step. Neither of them moves away. I don't usually say this, she begins quietly, but I'm glad you were with me today. James looks at her, surprised by the softness in her voice. I'm glad too, he replies. No, she says, shaking her head slightly. I mean, I'm glad it was you. That sentence stays with him. He doesn't answer right away. When he does, his voice is low. So am I. Back at the homestay, the lights inside glow warmly against the darkening night. The host greets them with a nod, leaves them to their space. They sit together on the steps again, just like in the morning, except now the air is cooler, the world quieter. Diep pulls the bracelet from her pocket and slips it onto her wrist. She studies it for a second, then looks at James. Thank you, she says. For what this time? He asks gently. For not trying to fix me, she replies. For just staying. James considers that. Thank you for letting me. She smiles at that, small but real. The night settles in around them. No plans for tomorrow. No promises spoken aloud. Just the steady presence of two people choosing again and again to sit side by side. And for now, that feels like enough.
Xin chào mọi người. Trong tập này, Linda và Linda theo bà và cậu cháu ra nương mía. Dưới nắng sớm, bà vừa chặt mía vừa kể chuyện ngày xưa. Dậy chặt 3 hoặc 4 khúc cho đẹp để bán được giá. Đồng mía cao dần, 45 đồng trở thành hy vọng cho phiên chợ. Một cây mía đổ bất ngờ khiến cả nhóm kêu, rồi cười xòa vì kịp đỡ nhau. Chiều xuống, Linda buồn bã. vì con rúi của mình đã biến mất. Nghi có kẻ trộm rình quanh nhà. CEO quang ghế đến lắng nghe và trấn an và tự sửa chiếc camera cũ trong kho, kéo dây lắp trước sân nhà để bảo vệ cô. Đêm đến, Linda nấu cơm nếp cẩm mời anh ở lại ăn. Hai người trò chuyện lòng ấm lại. Quang kể áp lực công ty, camera nháy sáng, bóng lạ thoáng qua, và không biết Linda có sống sót qua được đêm nay không. Mọi người nếu thấy video hay, hãy cho mình một like, một subscribe. Cảm ơn mọi người nhé.